Good morning and welcome to, what is this? Session 19 of Understanding and Exploring LDS History, where I say every week I'm doing the best I can as we work through the history of the LDS Church together. I want to be as gracious as I can possibly be in my speech, and I don't want to be mean-spirited. I don't want to be hateful. I want to be as loving as I can possibly be. And understand this all comes from a heart of love, but at the same time, we just want to know what is true. And the only intention behind this class as we work through the history of the church is what does history actually tell us? And I'm doing the best I can in doing that, to do that in a loving way, but also to be honest in doing so. So we left off last week in the spring of 1832, where in 1831 Joseph Smith had gotten some of the church settled in Independence, Missouri, which was going to be Zion and the New Jerusalem, where a temple would be built and where Jesus would return, they believed, within that generation. And so he had gotten the saints settled in Independence, which at the time was just a rough and tumble beginning frontier town. And he left a couple hundred converts there, and then he promptly moved back to Kirtland. So in that winter of 1831, 1832, you had the two main branches of the church. Part of the church is in Kirtland, Ohio, and part of the church is in Independence, Missouri. Smith spent that winter of 1831, 1832 in Hiram, about 40 miles south of Kirtland, where a family by the name of the Johnsons, they put him up for the winter, and he spent that winter working on his edition of the Bible, his edited version of the Bible, which was never published. And if you missed last week, you can go back and we talked about that a little. And also working on preparing his revelations for publication that would first be published as the Book of Commandments and then later as the Doctrine and Covenants. But by the spring of 1832, things were starting to go south for Smith in the town of Hiram for several reasons. He's living there with Emma and their newborn son that had just been born and the two twins that they had adopted, so that's a house full. And so sometimes just you have house guests for a long time, you start wearing on each other a little bit. But the oldest of the Johnsons' sons had left the church in this period. And so that created a lot of friction because now they were very antagonistic towards the church. Another local believer named Simmons Ryder had left the church because in a revelation, his name had been misspelled. And so one thing you can say about human beings across all time is we're petty. And we've always been petty. I've been a pastor long enough to tell you that sometimes the stuff people get upset about in church, I walk away going, what? I didn't see that one coming. I can't believe that's anything somebody would get so mad about. But his name was misspelled, and I don't know if he thought God should have known how to spell his name or why he got upset. But he left the church, and he became a very outspoken critic. And then you might remember we met Ezra Booth last week. He was one of the group that was selected to go to Independence and found the colony there. But as a result of that trip, he became convinced that Smith wasn't a prophet because he said before they left, there's going to be hundreds of converts to meet us there. And then they got there and there's 3 or 4. And Smith kept having new revelations to cover the old revelations. And so in that whole process, he was the first outspoken apostate from the church. So he had left. But he went back to Ohio, and the Ohio Star ran a series of letters from him that everybody in the community read, and they caused quite a stir. And I looked those letters up this week, and a few of them I thought were interesting enough that they're worth taking the time to mention. I found this a picture of Booth, but I found this letter to be humorous because he talks about his experience with Martin Harris. And in this whole working through the history of the church, I think if there's any of the founders of the church I would like to have met, I would just have liked to meet Martin Harris because he seems like quite a character. And we've gotten to know him pretty well over the weeks. And here's what he had to say. Booth said in the Ohio Star, Joseph Smith Jr., Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris may be considered as the principals in this work. And let Martin Harris tell the story. He's the most conspicuous of the four. He informed me that he went to the place where Joseph resided, and Joseph had given it up on account of the opposition of his wife and others. That he had talked to him, and Smith said, "This ain't worth it, I'm walking away." And he told Smith, "I have not come down here for nothing, and we will go on with it." Martin Harris is what may be called a great talker. And all of the witnesses are in agreement on that with Harris. He was a great talker and an extravagant boaster, so much so that he renders himself disagreeable to many of his own society. In other words, other Mormons. The money he has expended, the great things he has done, form a considerable topic of his conversation. He understands all prophecies and knows everything by the Spirit, and he can silence almost any opposer by talking faster and louder than he can. You have somebody in your life that's that way, don't you? I have people in my life that, man, they're just so quick that you can't win an argument because they just think faster than you do. And you know they're wrong, but they just talk so fast that you can't stay up. So he can talk faster and louder, or by telling him, "I know everything and you know nothing. I am a wise man and you are a fool." And in this respect, he stands a fair sample of many others in the church. And if you disagree with him, we're just wise and you're not. Since my return from Missouri, he said, since my return, I've had several interviews with Messrs. Smith, Rigdon, and Cowdery, and the various shifts and turns to which they resorted in order to obviate objections and difficulties, produced in my mind additional evidence that theirs is nothing else than a deeply laid plan of craft and deception. So he'd come away convinced it was a fraud, and this all ran in the papers, right? So that got a lot of people stirred up. He said in another article, in this department, and he's talking here about everybody in the church is getting revelations from God. In this department of receiving revelation, though Smith is the principal, yet there are others who profess to receive revelations. But after all, it's Smith who decides whether they come from the Lord or the devil. And some have been so unfortunate as to have their revelations palmed on the latter. These revelations entirely supersede the Bible. And in fact, the Bible is declared to be too defective to be trusted in its present form. And Smith was working on his own revision while these articles were running. It's designed that it shall undergo a thorough alteration, or as they say, translation. The revelations are said to be an addition to the Bible, but instead of being an addition, they destroy its use. For everything which need to be known, whether present, past, or future, they can learn from Smith. For he has declared to the church that he knows all things that will take place from this time unto the end of the world. If then placing the Bible under circumstances which render it entirely useless is infidelity, then Mormonism is infidelity. So, pretty strong series of articles that the Ohio Star ran, and so that got a lot of people worked up in the area. So by the spring of 1832, people in Hiram were very upset. And at the same time, Smith learned that there was a rebellion brewing in Missouri, and we'll talk about why in a minute. But that if he didn't get to independence real soon, there was going to be mass apostasy from the church because people in independence were really upset. So him and Rigdon immediately began making plans to go visit Independence, but before they could leave, one of the twins that you might remember that they had adopted was really sick with measles. And Joseph was sitting up late one night taking care of him when a mob from the town, a drunken mob, broke into the home, stripped Smith naked, beat the fool out of him, and beat him, cut him up pretty bad. Drug him out of the house. And one of them, Eli Johnson, one of the sons, demanded that Smith be castrated. And the only thing that kept them from carrying that out was the doctor they had picked to do the castration lost his nerve at the last minute and refused to do it. So they beat him severely. Then they poured hot oil all over him, ripped open a pillowcase, and feathered him. So they tarred and feathered him, which is a common frontier form of justice. They beat him badly enough that when they finally left him, they beat up Rigdon also till he was unconscious. But it was said that when he came back to the door afterward, Emma saw him and passed out because she thought it was blood that was all over him. And they spent the remainder of the night. Apparently, it is the worst part about it is the only way to get all that off is to just slowly, painfully scrape away at it until you scrape all the tar and feathers off, which would be even worse when you've been beaten. This was the only act of violence against the Mormons in Ohio. A lot of others in other places that we will get to. But this was the worst of the lot in Ohio. So Smith was scheduled to preach the next morning. This was on a Saturday. He was scheduled to preach the next morning. So they all gathered for the meeting, and several people that were involved in the meeting were in the crowd and just waiting to see how he would respond and what would go down. And to his credit, Smith, in that meeting, he got up with his wounds clearly visible. You could tell he had been beaten. He preached calmly and confidently and never mentioned a word of his accusers being there or said anything about it. And so, and regardless where you land on all of this, right, this is wrong the way that they treated him, right? This is supposed to be America, and we have freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And so this is wrong the way they treated Smith, and it's admirable to me. He took the high road in this. When he could have escalated it, he took the high road in this, and he didn't retaliate. And in the eyes of his followers, it kind of escalated him even higher, in that they admired how he handled it. I admire how he handled this situation. So, he and Rigdon left for Missouri, and the problem was you have this colony in Missouri who had never quite forgiven Smith for leaving them to go back to Ohio. This is supposed to be Zion, and this is where the temple is going to be built, and this is where Jesus is going to return. This is where the 10 tribes are going to return to. Everything's happening here according to all of your prophecy, and you left us to go back to Ohio. And so they felt abandoned by their prophet. They were still very worried that, Rigdon had too much influence over Smith, and they worried about him swaying Smith away. And they were really ticked because Cowdery and Whitmer and Harris and a lot of the key founders, they're all in Missouri now. But all the key positions in the church had been given to people in Kirtland. And so they have been left high and dry. Cowdery was just an assistant printer. Harris and Whitmer had no office in the church whatsoever. And so that stung a little bit. When Joseph's gone back to Ohio, he's left us here. He's given all these key positions out to people in Ohio. We're here struggling. We're trying to make it. And he's off up there. They never question things until, you remember we talked about the United Order, that they've got the order that everybody's supposed to consecrate everything to in Missouri, and another one in Kirtland, and they're all supposed to be living communally. And it was working better for the people in Missouri than it was for the people in Kirtland. And so they didn't appreciate it when they were asked by Revelation to pay for the debts Kirtland had accumulated. So you got all of this stuff going on. So Smith and Rigdon traveled to Independence to put out the fires, and they were able to do so. Remarkably quick, they were able to do so. And I don't know exactly how it all went down, but it speaks to me in some regard. I think Smith was so good with people, in reading people, and talking to people, because he was able to put out the fires pretty quickly, get everybody appeased. He coordinated the United Order. He set up a new board. He put Cowdery and Harris on the board, so he gave them positions and kind of placated them. And he got everything calmed down. And it began a period, 1832 and 1833, they had remarkable growth in Missouri. When Smith left to return to Ohio in May, so he didn't stay long, and he went back to Ohio again. When he left, there was about 300 converts in Independence. By the end of the year, there would be 600, and by 1833, there would be 1,200. So the church really began to grow. And the church in Missouri, in a lot of ways, they were poor, really poor, if you read some of the accounts. This was frontier town, right? This is not an established town with nice homes and a village full of shops like Kirtland was. It's a frontier town. They're literally whittling out an existence, farming not the best of land, and throwing up rough log houses, right? They are living rough. But they lived together really well. And the church thrived. And even though they were very poor, like really poor when you read some of the accounts of what they were eating, just very rough, cornmeal that they're taking corn and, grating it down and trying to make bread out of it. But they were surviving, and the church was thriving, and they were close and a lot of harmony. So the church just really, really grew, even though they were very poor. And part of what kept them so happy was, at this same time, the federal government had been buying up land in Ohio and Kentucky and in Illinois and forcing all the Native American residents of that area, forcing them out to the Indian land in Kansas, out west, to which was the Indian Territory at the time. So the government's buying up this land, forcing the Native Americans west, and all of those Native Americans from half a dozen different tribes are coming west through Independence, which is on the border of Missouri and Kansas, coming through Independence, and the Mormons watched all of that just in ecstasy, because in their mind, this was prophecy being fulfilled. God was gathering the Lamanites together in preparation for Jesus' return. And so they believed this was the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy that Jesus made in the book of Nephi, in the Book of Mormon, where in the Book of Mormon storyline, when Jesus was resurrected and he appeared to the apostles in Jerusalem and started a church there, according to the Book of Mormon, he also appeared to the Nephites in the New World and appointed 12 apostles and started a Christian church in America in 33 AD. As part of what he told the Nephites when he appeared to them, Jesus made this prophecy in 3rd Nephi. Jesus said, "And then shall the remnants which shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth be gathered in from the east and from the west and the south and the north, and they will be brought to the knowledge of the Lord their God, who hath redeemed them. And the Father hath commanded me that I should give unto you this land." And so he's talking to the Nephites in America, right? So this is the land that the Mormons believe that they're on. "I'll give you this land for your inheritance. And I say unto you that if the Gentiles do not repent after the blessings which they shall receive, after they have scattered my people, then shall ye, who are a remnant of the house of Jacob, go forth among them, and will be in the midst of them who shall be many, and ye shall be among them as a lion. Thy hand shall be lifted upon thine adversaries, and all thine enemies shall be cut off. And I will gather my people together as a man gathereth his sheaves into the floor. And it shall come to pass, saith the Father, that the sword of my justice shall hang over them at that day. And except they repent, it shall fall upon them, saith the Father, yea, even upon all the nations of the Gentiles. And it will come to pass that I will establish my people, O house of Israel, and behold, this people will I establish in this land, and independence, under the fulfilling of the covenant which I made with your father Jacob, and it shall be a new Jerusalem. And the powers of heaven shall be in the midst of you. I will be in the midst of you." And so they see all these Native Americans coming across the border, and they think it's this prophecy being fulfilled. There's going to be this great gathering and conversion of the Lamanites, which never happened. But that's what they thought was happening at the time. But you can also see how this might not go over so well with the Gentiles, who was everybody else outside of the church. And that prophecy doesn't have much good to say about what's going to happen to the Gentiles, to those who don't believe. So the problem they began to run into in independence was they weren't there first. And the old settlers, they called them, of independence, the people who had founded it and who had been around a while, they looked upon the Mormons as troublemakers almost from the very beginning. And there were several reasons for that. Jackson County was settled largely, right? This was a frontier town. So it was largely uneducated, rough and tumble, tough people, right? Who did not appreciate being told every day that they were Gentiles and that they were lost and facing God's judgment any day now if they didn't repent, right? This is going to be the New Jerusalem, and all of you people who don't believe and get your act together, God, you're going to be toast. And the Mormons were telling them every day, and a lot of these were people who would have considered themselves good, God-fearing Christians, right? And now they're being told they're Gentile heathens. That didn't rest well. It also didn't rest well with a lot of them. There was tension from the beginning because Missouri was largely settled by slave-holding Southerners, and the Mormons were almost entirely Yankees from the north. You know, they're all from New York and Ohio. So they didn't appreciate all these Yankees moving in on top of them. So you got all of these tensions almost right from the beginning. They didn't appreciate the saints saying this land was theirs by divine right. They made sure everybody knew it. The Evening and Morning Star, the LDS paper, constantly ran columns berating non-Mormons, calling them to repent. Phelps ran article after article, keeping track of all the Indian tribes as they came through, and ran them in the Evening and Morning Star. It's the great gathering, and you guys better get your act together. Just a couple of examples. Here's an edition of the Evening and Morning Star from 1833. And I don't know if you can see it, but the highlighted portion says, "We live in a great time, one of the most eventful periods that has ever been. It's not only the time when the captivity of Jacob's tents will return, but it is the time when the wicked and their works shall be destroyed." That'd make you a little nervous if you're one of the ones considered wicked, right? "When the earth shall be restored to its former beauty and goodness, and shall yield its increase. When plagues shall be sent to humble the haughty, and bring them in, if they will, to a knowledge of God. Yea, it is a time when the wicked cannot expect to see the next generation." It is that great time. And they ran edition after edition that said similar things, which led some of those who weren't Mormon to think like this. This is from the Western Monitor, which was not an LDS paper, where somebody said, "We are daily told, and not by the ignorant alone, but by all classes of them, that we, the Gentiles of this county, are to be cut off, and our lands appropriated by them for inheritances. Whether this is to be accomplished by the hand of the destroying angel, the judgments of God, or the arms of power, they are not fully agreed among themselves. But they are agreed that this is their land, and they're going to end up having all of it when this is all done, because God's given it to us." So you can see how this would lead to some tensions, right? And then by September of 1832, Smith had officially defined the wicked, in case anybody wondered, as anyone who rejected Mormon beliefs. You are part of the wicked. He had this revelation in September of 1832, which is Doctrine and Covenants 84 today, where Jesus says, "By this you may know that they are under the bondage of sin, because they come not unto me. For whoso cometh not unto me is under the bondage of sin. And whoso receiveth not my voice is not acquainted with my voice, and is not of me. And by this you may know the righteous from the wicked." Now that doesn't sound too bad, right? In fact, that sounds pretty similar to some things Jesus said in the Gospel of John, right? Doctrinally, there's not a whole lot there, other than the fact that they defined this as anybody who wasn't Mormon, was not coming unto Jesus. So you're part of the wicked. You're on the outside looking in. So everything's defined in black and white terms. You got the saints saying, We're the true Israel. We're the elect. We're right. Everybody else is a sinner and a Gentile. They're the wicked. And so you had this us versus them mentality that kind of led to several things. It enabled Smith's followers to view any unbeliever as part of Satan's forces, and you're hindering the kingdom's progress. And any disagreement with anything they thought was any criticism of their belief, then it's an attack of the devil. It made them very zealous in evangelism, right? Which part of me goes, at least they practiced what they preached, right? At least they practiced what they preached. They believed that Jesus was returning and it was imminent, and anybody who wasn't a part was going to be on the outside looking in and face God's judgment. So they were very zealous in their evangelism. Any persecution was just a sign that they were right, because Jesus said, that we would suffer for His name. So any persecution was just proof that they were right. And it motivated a lot of Mormons to respond to any criticism with just more doomsday threats and prophetic condemnations. I like what one LDS historian said. He's passed away now. He was a BYU professor. But Michael Quinn said, 19th century Mormonism was not polite. And I think that's an accurate description. But, and I've said this before, part of me goes, I at least admire that you drew the lines clearly. And you said, we think we're right and we think you're wrong. And then at least you can allow it. It wasn't this nice, we're all the same, everything's all good kind of deal. At least they were very clear in their intentions. They were very clear in their beliefs that we're right. We're true Israel. Everybody else on the outside, you're wrong. And so at least they were honest in admitting that. And they were very honest about it. And sometimes, as Quinn says, not very polite in the way they viewed Gentiles and they spoke to people who were on the outside of the church. So you got all of this tension between the old settlers and these new settlers who are watching their numbers grow every day. And over time, they begin to realize if they keep coming in this fast, and all of the new poor converts were coming to independence because, they had nothing. And so the church is giving them an allotment and they're living communally. And so they're just coming in, and they begin to realize it's not going to be very long when we're not going to have the votes anymore when we elect government officials for Jackson County, because there's going to be more of them than there is of us. So all of this is boiling under the surface. Meanwhile, Smith remains in Ohio, and they never quite forgave him for not being there and pleaded with him to be there. Phelps, who was the editor of the Evening and Morning Star, kept harassing Smith about, when are you coming? You need to be in Zion. You're the head of the church. Jesus is coming back in any moment. All of these Native Americans are flooding in. It's happening. Where are you? You need to be here. And he kept pleading with him and pleading with him. You have to be here, until finally the only way Smith could get him to be quiet was through revelation. Where Smith had this revelation in March of 1833, God says in Doctrine and Covenants 90, Behold, verily I say unto you, that ye shall write this commandment, and say unto your brethren in Zion, in love greeting, that I have called you also to preside over Zion in mine own due time. Therefore let them cease worrying me concerning the matter. So God says, tell them to stop bugging me about this. You will go to Zion when I'm ready for you to go to Zion. And so Smith remained in Ohio and away from the church. So stick a pin in that for a minute and just keep in your hat that church is growing like crazy in Missouri, but you've got resentment from the old settlers, and that's all going to start boiling over next week when we come back to Missouri again. Meanwhile, in November of 1832, Emma gave birth to Joseph Smith III. This was the youngest picture I could find of him. Sorry, no baby pictures. But Joseph Smith III was born in November of 1832. This is the first, if you've been following along, of Joseph and Emma's children to survive past infancy, to survive more than just a few hours past birth. And he will become a very major player later on down the road. When Joseph Smith is killed in 1844, Joseph Smith III was only 11. And so a lot of people thought he should be the next head of the church, but he was only 11. So in the leadership crisis that ensued, all sorts of chaos that we'll eventually get to. But he eventually, down the road as an adult, became the head of the reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints, which is the Community of Christ today, which until just recently has always been led by a descendant of Joseph Smith, down until today. Meanwhile, on the national stage, things were heating up between the North and the South. And in 1832, South Carolina was threatening. What year did the Civil War begin? Anybody? 1861. Very good. All right, so we're still a ways off. But in 1832, South Carolina was threatening to secede from the Union even then. And Andrew Jackson was having none of it. He called in the big guns and sent federal troops to put it down. And anyway, there's a lot of tension going on. And nobody knew what South Carolina was going to do at the moment. Smith saw this happening, and he could only see it in terms of the millennium. And some of you will be familiar with this, but this is December 25th, 1832. Smith made what is probably his most famous prophecy, where he prophesied this in December of 1832. It's Doctrine and Covenants 87 today. Smith said, "Verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. And the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place," South Carolina. "For behold, the southern states will be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves against other nations, and then war will be poured out upon all nations. And it will come to pass after many days that slaves will rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war." And a lot of LDS today love to point back to this prophecy as evidence of Smith's prophetic prowess. And I would say several things just on the surface of that. First of all, it didn't take a prophet to see that trouble was coming between the North and the South, even in 1832. I think it's evident, which we're talking about just a sec, Smith thought it was getting ready to break out then. Now, you can look back and say shortly is still 30 years. I get that. But Smith wasn't thinking 30 years when he wrote this prophecy, and I think that's evident. Furthermore, the Civil War wasn't poured out upon all nations. It was confined to the United States. A lot of people did die, but it was hardly a world war. You could say World War I was poured out upon all nations, and that wouldn't be a stretch. But the Civil War wasn't. Furthermore, Great Britain never got involved officially in the Civil War. They remained neutral throughout. The southern states did try as hard as they could to get them to take their side, and some people in Great Britain on their own, there were some that supported the North and some that supported the South. But officially, as a country, their position was neutrality. They never took sides in the Civil War. So there's issues there. War didn't break out for 28 years. And it's evident that Smith thought this was something that was going to happen soon, because when Jackson put the rebellion of South Carolina down, things got ironed out for the moment. Smith quietly set this prophecy aside. It was never published. Nothing was ever said about it, because I think at the time he was thinking, well, that didn't work out, right? Everything got patched up. It wasn't until 19 years later that Brigham Young came across this prophecy, and he could see trouble brewing then, and he had it published 19 years after the fact. But it's evident at the time that Smith didn't think at least it appears to me that this was going to work out the way he thought, because nothing was ever said about it until many years later. All right. It was a good year. 1832 and 33 was good years in Missouri, but it was also great years in Kirtland. And converts began to stream in from the church's missionary efforts back east, and they began to stream into Kirtland. And just as a way of mentioning that most everyone's their first impressions of Joseph Smith were generally always very positive. Again, I think he was very good with people. If you look at pictures, one author said he just missed being handsome. Right? He's not a bad-looking guy. He's not supermodel, but he's not a bad-looking guy. He was very imposing. He was over 6 feet tall. He's late 20s by this time, so he's lost his gangliness and he's filling out. And he was amicable and friendly, and people just loved him. He would walk around town with his brothers, and they were very imposing is not the right word. They cut an impressive figure. They were all over 6 feet tall. They were all, you can see the family resemblance except for poor William. They all look really similar, and it might just be the picture of William. They all had prominent roles in Kirtland. Hiram was, of course, with him when he was killed at the Carthage jail. His youngest brother, Don Carlos, who, they look, Hiram and Don Carlos, all of them, they look very, very similar to Smith. So people liked him when they met him. He was very amicable, very jovial. He's still in his 20s. He liked to, he'd get on the ground with the kids, and he was very proud of his abilities as a wrestler. And that was a manly thing then, right? Grappling, whatever. That was a manly thing to do, and he was good at it, and he was very proud of his abilities, and he'd get down on the ground and play with kids. And the story's told of one converts from back east who, when they pulled into the town the first time they met Smith, they saw him on the ground playing with a bunch of kids, and they just turned their wagon around and went back, because they didn't think that was the way a prophet should be behaving. That was beneath a prophet to do that. But most people loved him and were very drawn to him. And so the church was growing in Kirtland. You've got all these converts coming in. Things were going really well. About this same time period, Joseph finally got a house of his own and a 140-acre farm, of course, and he's living now full-time off of proceeds from the church, which led the editor of the Painesville Telegraph to write this. E.D. Howe said, "Thus it is that these self-made prophets and high priests are acquiring possessions of real estate in a rich and flourishing country, while their dupes are packed off to the wilds of Missouri." And I don't have a problem with Smith having a house on 140 acres, but I do understand, why are you uncomfortable living the good life in Kirtland while everybody else is suffering in Zion? This is supposed to be the New Jerusalem. Why aren't you there? So there's always that tension a little bit between the church in Kirtland and the church in Missouri. One other interesting tidbit, and we'll wrap it up for today. One afternoon in 1832, Smith was out behind the house chopping wood when somebody brought a new convert by who had just moved into the area from Vermont. And he was older than Smith, shorter, stocky, very powerfully built. He'd worked with his hands all of his life. And they just clicked. They spent the whole day together talking. And that evening they went to a cottage meeting together, and Smith asked this young man to pray at the end of that meeting, and this young man prayed in tongues when Smith asked him to pray, which was something that Smith had been trying to suppress in the church. But instead of chastising or correcting this young man when he prayed in tongues, Smith said that he was actually praying in the true Adamic language. He was speaking in the language of Adam. And so it's interesting that in one day, there was something with this young man that Smith didn't feel comfortable in correcting him, at least in public. But Smith would continue to discourage the misuse of tongues, but it was very prevalent in the early Mormon church. The interesting thing, though, is that young man's name was Brigham Young, who you might have heard of before. And this is where Brigham Young enters our story, and of course, he would very quickly become one of the, when they appointed the first quorum of the 12, he was one of the 12. And the one who, in my humble opinion, he's the one responsible for the church being where they are today. And his vision to get them to Utah where they could get away from some of the harassment that they'd faced everywhere else that they had been, he was a visionary. And so he'll become, of course, a key part of our story moving forward. But we'll break for there today. So just remember for today, you got the church in Independence growing, doing well, very poor, but they think Zion's coming. You got the church in Kirtland growing, doing very well. Smith is there. Most of the leaders are there. But next week, everything falls apart in Missouri. And that's where we'll pick up then and how they handled that. All right, we'll stop there for today. Let me pray for us, and then I'll have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.